The debate over California's delta smelt and water policies are heating up again after the presidential executive order putting people over fish. In California, we have prioritized endangered species like delta smelt over farmers and farmland when it comes to water. As a result of it, thousands of acres of farmland has been fallowed. My guest today is Tom Holyoke, who's a Fresno State University professor that specializes in water policy in the Western region.
People of California really need to find a way to solve our political battles over water, which are probably more intractable than any of our engineering or hydrological problems. The single best thing that we can do is store more water when we have it. The best way to store water is to store it underground. The state's laws, interestingly enough, say you cannot just take water and store it.
Will California change its water policies? In today's episode, we dive in deep to understand how the water is currently distributed out of the Delta and current proposals to potentially change this outside of the courtroom. I'm Siamak Korami. Welcome to California Insider. Tom, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
We want to talk to you about a controversial topic that has become very controversial in the state. It's the delta smelt and how the state is getting its water to Southern California. Can you explain to us how the water transportation system is set up in the Delta?
Sure. It's a bit of a complicated topic, but California's water comes from the northern part of the state. And there's two systems for bringing it south. One was built by the federal government in the 1940s, the other built by the state of California in the late 1950s. For the federal project, water is stored in Shasta Lake behind Shasta Dam on the Sacramento River. It's allowed to flow south in controlled pulses, where it enters then the Delta region between Sacramento and San Francisco. The water goes through the Delta and is pumped out with a set of massive pumps and put into a large canal called the Delta-Mendota Canal. And from there it provides irrigation water for a good portion of the valley. The state system, the water is collected from the Feather River behind Oroville Dam at Lake Oroville, and then also released in controlled pulses into the Delta, where another set of really large pumps pulls it out and puts it into the California Aqueduct. California Aqueduct then takes it down south, up over the Tehachapi Mountains into Southern California.
And why are these pumps exist? Is it because they have to bring the water up?
Yeah, so to get water into the Delta-Mendota Canal and into the California Aqueduct, these giant pumps have to literally pull the water out of the Delta and then deposit the water into the canals. There's no other mechanism for getting the water out and putting it into those canals. And we're talking about huge volumes of water as well. So these are really, really big, powerful pumps.
And how much do they have to elevate the water? Like how much higher does the water have to go?
The water probably goes up 20, 30 feet or so, I suppose. I've never been able to get a close look at the pumps. They don't let people down there. But yeah, it's just the sheer volume of water that we're pulling out that requires so much power.
There's an endangered species, delta smelt, and why is this has become such a controversy?
Sure. Once around the 1990s, a lot of concern was being expressed about environmental damage being done in the Delta, including several fish species that seemed to be in rapid decline. The salmon, Sacramento splittail, and the delta smelt. By the early 21st century, it started to look like the delta smelt was in a lot of trouble and in danger of going extinct. Now, there's a federal law called the Endangered Species Act. There's also a state Endangered Species Act, which is essentially the same thing at the state level. These require the government to do everything possible to stop that species from going extinct, use whatever powers it has to stop the species from going extinct. The question then became what exactly was causing the delta smelt to go into decline, and that's where the controversies began.
And what are the thoughts on that?
Yeah, so a lot of work has been done by biologists, and it's still not exactly clear what was hurting the delta smelt. In fact, chances are a number of things were affecting the delta smelt. Part of it was probably the intrusion of salty water, I mean, the delta opens up onto the ocean. If there's not enough fresh water, then salt water from the ocean comes in, and that's bad for the delta smelt, which is a freshwater fish. There's a variety of predators on the delta smelt. There could be some problems with Sacramento's municipal utility district putting its wastewater into the delta, not too far from there. But the main blame has been put on the pumps for the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. And it is true that the pumps operate at such a strong level that many delta smelt are sucked into the pumps and therefore killed.
And does the delta smelt exist now? Has it been observed? Does it?
This is a very good question, actually. Once a year, I think it's once a year, biologists do a smelt count. And the last couple of years, they have not been finding much at all. In fact, I think even one year, they didn't find any smelt. So there's some concern that it may already be too late for the smelt. Now, these population counts are difficult to do and not very decisive, so there could still be smelt there. But if there is still a smelt population, it's probably very small, and in some people's minds, maybe it's too late to save it from extinction. We don't know.
And the idea is that the smelt is getting sucked in by the pumps, and the pumps are destroying the smelt. Is this why people don't like these pumps, or they don't want us to pump more water out of them?
Yeah, well, when the pumps were identified as a cause, indeed identified as the principal cause, many environmental interests certainly wanted to have the pumps completely shut down. But even also the sports fishing industry was supportive of shutting down the pumps because, the delta smelt are eaten by other kinds of fish that a lot of people like to come fish and support the sports fishing industry. Now, what actually happened was that after a series of lawsuits, federal courts ordered a partial shutting down of the pumps. When the delta smelt happened to be in that region of the delta, by federal court order, the pumps were to be shut down so as not to suck in the fish. It's not a permanent shutdown, but it is a shutdown at a time when they really need to be going, the pumps.
And can you tell us the impact of these pumps not working? What's the impact of them?
This is a loss then of irrigation water to farmers in the San Joaquin Valley. Farmers who are used to getting their irrigation water off the Delta Mendota Canal. I mean, theoretically, it should have been a loss of water to the State Water Project as well, but since the State Water Project largely supports cities, the law of California says cities have a priority over agriculture. So in practice, the cutbacks hit agriculture pretty hard. So that, in other words, is frankly just less water for irrigation, and that has caused many farmers in parts of the San Joaquin Valley to fallow lands. So that's less agricultural production, and of course that has adverse ripple effects in farming economies here in the valley. Many of these smaller communities in the valley are largely composed of made up of farm workers. And when there are no crops to be harvested, there's no jobs for farm workers to have. And so they are unemployed. And in some of these small towns, especially during the serious drought years, remember 2014, 2015, but even still somewhat today, this would lead to unemployment levels well in excess of 50%. 50, not 15, wow. 50%.
So, and these pumps right now, are they working? They're not working at full capacity because of these lawsuits, right? Do you know at what capacity they're working?
Well, I couldn't tell you exactly today what they are doing, but the main problem is that they simply are not working at the points in time when they need to be working the most. I mean, there are points in time when there's a lot more fresh water coming into the delta, because all that fresh water is snow melt. So when the spring hits and the snows melt in Northern California, that is when the most fresh water comes into the delta. And that's when the pumps are really needed. But it also happens to be the time when the delta smelt tend to be in that part of the delta where the pumps are. So in other words, when the pumps need to be active, they're not. And if that water is not captured, it ultimately flows out into the Pacific Ocean.
We are honored to be sponsored by Shenyun. Shenyun Performing Arts is reviving 5,000 years of lost Chinese traditional culture. It takes you back in time to the magical world of ancient China with a unique blend of brilliant dancing, beautiful costumes, and legends coming to life. The show choreography and production values are top-notch. However, it isn't just the technical ability of the dancers. It's the inner beauty and the devotion of the artist that will stir your soul to move you to tears. Make sure to go see it this year. Go to shenyun.com and book your tickets today.
It was spectacular, so beautiful.
I thought I was going to heaven.
Oh, it was electric.
I'm getting chills talking about it.
It gets a 10 from me, that's for sure.
It was that good.
Absolutely marvelous.
Hands down the best show I've ever seen.
So it seems like the Delta smelt is prioritized. First is the need for the cities, and then it's Delta smelt, and then it's the farmers, right?
Well, that's certainly the perception of it from here in the valley, which is why the farmers complain a lot about, the government putting fish over people. And the law does require that the government do everything it can to save a species from going extinct, and that does not take into consideration adverse impacts on human civilization. So there is some justification for farmers to feel that this favors fish over people.
If this smelt wasn't part of this endangered species, would these pumps be fully operating all the time? How would it look like? What would it look like?
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, if the Endangered Species Act was, let's say, repealed, Congress could do that. And if other supporting environmental acts were repealed, then theoretically, I can't imagine that there would be a legal barrier to having the pumps on. There could potentially be other reasons, I don't know. But that would be one removal of one legal barrier. And yeah, theoretically, the pumps would be more active if the Endangered Species Act was not there.
And is there enough water to support these pumps in fresh water coming in?
That depends on the year. I mean, California's precipitation is all over the place. In a wet year where we have a heavy snowfall, a heavy snowpack in the mountains, there'd be plenty of water. Other years when there's not much of a snowpack, no, there really isn't enough water to go around in the state. And the state needs to keep a certain amount of fresh water in the delta anyway to hold back the ocean. There's a lot of agriculture that happens in the delta region as well. It's not just the San Joaquin Valley. And if there's saltwater intrusion into delta farmlands, that means salt water will destroy their land. And they're big proponents of also keeping the pumps not running all the time.
And is there a big, besides being an endangered species, the Delta smelt, is there any big environmental impact of this fish for that region? Because there's been some arguments that this is part of the food chain of other species, and it will have a really big impact if it goes away.
Sure. Of course. I mean, yeah, the Delta smelt would certainly be part of the food chain in the Delta. It's part of the ecological, web of the Delta. You remove any piece of that, and species higher up the food chain are going to suffer. Again, this is why the sports fishing industry is supportive of the environmentalists in these kinds of lawsuits, because larger fish, like I think striped mouth bass comes to mind, they eat Delta smelt. No Delta smelt, then that's going to harm the bass population. That'll harm the sports fishing industry. But it's also, waterfowl that eat smelt, and you remove one species, and it could have potentially catastrophic effects along the entire Delta ecosystem.
Would that impact us in a way if that happens?
I mean, the loss of the sports fishing industry, it's an employer and a revenue generator in California, that would have a financial impact to the state. To some extent, ecological damage in the Delta might also hurt the commercial fishing industry, and that would be a big blow to the state. As for increased pumping, would that be a counter benefit for the state? It's hard to tell. Agriculture, for all that it provides, I think only provides about 2 to 3% of all of the revenue generated in California. It's a huge employer, certainly, but it's not California's economic driver. It's probably more likely is the tech industry, which is also, I would point out, a big water consumer. As I understand, I've heard it said that computer chips require be washed 6 times in really clean fresh water.
They want to have tunnels in the Delta. Can you tell us about those projects?
Well, we're down to 1 tunnel now. Governor Brown had proposed 2 tunnels, and really what this is, it's viewers might remember late 1970s, early 1980s, the peripheral canal proposal, which was to ship Sacramento River water in a new canal around the Delta and deposit it by the pumps. Voters then defeated that in a referendum. Governor Brown's tunnel proposal is the same thing, except that instead of moving fresh water around the Delta, it would move it under the Delta. Governor Newsom has scaled it back to 1 tunnel. But the idea is that if we can intercept fresh Sacramento River water further north and then deposit it right at the pumps, that means the pumps would have to work less hard to be able to pump up fresh water for the canals. And if the pumps are working with less power, there'd be less suction, and it's less likely to suck in the Delta smelt or whatever fish in and destroy them. So theoretically, the tunnel proposal should be able to help the Delta smelt and San Joaquin Valley farmers, theoretically.
And when do you think is the timeline for that?
Well, that's anyone's guess, isn't it? I'm sure Governor Brown thought this would be done on his watch. It isn't going to be done on Governor Newsom's watch. They haven't actually started moving dirt yet. Now, from what I understand, there was a lot of environmental lawsuits trying to stop the tunnel project. I believe a lot of that has now been cleared away by the courts, perhaps all of it. I think the project is slowly moving towards a start date. But, how long is it going to take? I don't know. Maybe we'll see high-speed rail done first.
So, Tom, the environmentalists, so you're mentioning they were suing this tunnel, but this tunnel, isn't it supposed to help the smelt?
Yeah, so this is a strange situation. The original peripheral canal was, I believe, originally endorsed by several environmental groups, like the Sierra Club, as a way to help the smelt. And I think they even had expressed some support for the initial tunnel proposal. As time went on, they turned against the proposal. And I think they would still admit that it might provide some help for the Delta smelt in the southern Delta. Now they're expressing concern about what this might do to what kind of environmental damage it might have on the northern end of the Delta, where the Sacramento River would naturally spill its fresh water into the Delta, but the tunnel would instead take that water away. So environmentalists now seem to be concerned about ecological impacts on the north end of the Delta, and consequently have decided they just hate the whole tunnel idea. But there has been a decided shift in their policy goals and priorities.
So is there multiple different interests that are battling each other in the middle of this water projects?
Yeah, well, it would be wrong to say that all the environmental groups are on the same page or that they all act as a monolith. They most certainly do not. And I think there probably are environmental groups who are more supportive of the tunnel project. Please don't ask me to name a particular one. I can't seem to think of one off the top of my head, but my understanding is that there are some environmental groups that still see benefits of the tunnel.
Now, in terms of the transporting the water, do we lose water?
Well, there's probably always some water loss, partially because when the water goes into these canals, it's exposed to the sun. And especially when we get to July, August, September, there's going to be a certain degree of water loss just due to sheer evaporation, which, interestingly enough, has prodded us to start really thinking about covering some of our canals. In fact, in kind of an interesting 2-for-1 on the the Friant-Kern Canal, which is a big canal on the east side of the San Joaquin Valley. Not only are we covering it to reduce evaporation, but where we're covering it is with solar panels. So we can put the sun to some practical use and generate electricity.
There's President Trump, and he wants to do something about this. And the federal government, I don't know what their policy could be to help out the farmers, or would it get stopped by the courts?
So President Trump, in his first term in office, promised to help the farmers by getting them more water through the Central Valley Project. By and large, he was not really able to deliver on that. Things he tried got tied up in the courts. Second administration now, he still wants to fulfill those promises, and he's given orders to the Department of the Interior and the Department of Commerce. They're the two departments that have some jurisdiction over this, to find ways to move more water to the farmers. But that is not going to be easy to do. The operations of the federal government in the Delta are through an agency called the Bureau of Reclamation, part of the Interior Department. The law actually says that the Bureau of Reclamation is subject to the laws of California. It's a quirk that we don't see in most federal programs. But Bureau of Reclamation is subject to the laws of California. And that means California has a lot of management responsibility. It really has primary management responsibility of the Delta. So in other words, it's kind of California's choice about how long the pumps are run. And on top of that, we have federal court orders that still require the pumps to be stopped at certain times in order to try to save the smelt and some other endangered species. So within those constraints, which are pretty formidable, I'm not entirely sure exactly what the Trump administration is going to be able to do. I mean, maybe they'll come up with something novel. I don't know.
And who is in charge of this, of these pumps to make sure how much they're going to pump out? Is it the state leaders?
Well, the decisions is usually made by a few coordinating agencies, I guess we'll say, government agencies that are responsible for the Delta. And they generally set terms for how much water can be pumped out. I mean, the actual control of the Central Valley Project pumps is still under the control of the Bureau of Reclamation. I mean, they literally would throw the switches or do whatever you do to turn the pumps on or off, but they just simply can't do it when they feel like it. They're subject to the dictates of these coordinating agencies. It's a whole bureaucracy that manages the Delta.
And does the courts oversee them too because of these lawsuit settlements, or do they have to factor in the courts' lawsuit settlements into their decision?
It's more the latter, as I understand it. It's a complex web, but it's more of the latter, that these coordinating agencies are operating with, partially under court orders, but with certainly a healthy respect for the court orders.
Tom, you've been studying the water policies of the state, right?
Yeah.
For over the last 2 decades.
Yeah.
Is there a solution for us? Because we've heard from some experts that we have enough water, we just don't store it. We have heard from some other experts that we don't have enough water.
There's no easy solution, let's put it that way. However, probably the single best thing that we can do is store more water when we have it. I mean, some years we have enough water. Many years we don't have enough water. And so the challenge is to take those few years when we do have excess water and find ways to store it. And it's becoming a little more accepted that the best way to store water is to store it underground, is to turn it into groundwater. That way it cannot evaporate. You put water in a huge surface reservoir and you lose up to 40% of it to the sun. So storing it underground. But storing it underground there's physical challenges. You have to find the right kind of soil that can accommodate water. And there's also the challenges of getting it into the ground. You have to get the water, use fancy injection wells to do that. But there's also legal barriers, and that's probably the bigger problem right now, is that you just can't take excess water in a river and put it underground for storage. The state's laws, interestingly enough, say you cannot just take water and store it. You have to take water, you have to use it for something. We call that beneficial use. And frankly, the state really needs to make some changes in its water rights laws to make it easier from a legal point of view for us to store our water underground. That would be a huge, huge help.
So is it illegal to store water underground if you are a farmer and you put the water in, or if you're trying to store the water underground?
It's confusing because these are the questions that are now being asked, and it seems to me there's not a lot of legal clarity to it. But a couple of years ago, when we had a really huge snowpack and a lot of excess water in the state, there was a lot of concern that it was illegal to take those excess waters and put it underground. The governor actually had to issue a special proclamation waiving these legal restrictions, which you could only do on a temporary basis. But basically what he was waiving is the legal requirement that if you take water, you have to do something with the water, use it beneficially, which means you can't store the water, because that under the old law, that's considered water hoarding. The governor was able to temporarily suspend that so water could be stored, but the temporary measure is not what we need. We need the legislature to actually change the law to make it clearly legal for farmers to store that water.
And do you think this storing water underground needs to be done by farmers, or do you think there needs to be other projects that actually make these in a larger scale for the state?
Oh, it's not just farmers. Farmers certainly, but it also needs to be done a lot by cities that can do it, really need to be doing it. And the state is also full of these little government agencies that we call irrigation districts and water districts, which traditionally they exist to build irrigation infrastructure to help deliver water to farmers. And we have hundreds of them in the state. They should all be clearly empowered to be able to grab excess water, including flood water, and store it underground. That's something we really need the legislature to do.
Are there any other ideas to help with this situation?
Water recycling is something the state needs to give a larger priority to. We are getting better at it, but we could learn a lot from a city like Las Vegas. I've heard it said that Las Vegas recycles up to 90% of the water that the city uses. And Las Vegas is a city that, is less rainfall than any other city in the United States. And yet it has to support this, vast hotel infrastructure with tons of water requirements. They are good at water recycling. We could learn something from them. And, there's also, desalination. There's a lot of water there, in the ocean. There's certain problems with that. Building a water desalination plant is a big, expensive capital project. But more importantly, it takes quite a bit of energy to run a desalination plant. And then you also have the problem of when you take ocean water and desalinate it, you get fresh water, but then you also get a really, really highly salty brine water. What do we do with it? And initially the idea is throw it back in the ocean. Well, that the environmental laws probably won't allow that because it could be damaging actually to the ocean. So we need to do something with the brine water. So these kinds of problems need to be solved before we can really expand in desalination. But a combination of all of these things, more water storage, better water recycling, finding ways to do desalination, these are probably the things that are going to make California more water resilient. And just on top of that, probably some smarter uses of water by people, because most water wasted in the state is usually wasted in the home. Running sprinklers when perhaps we shouldn't, drippy faucets, bad toilet flappers, huge amounts of water are lost from those things.
Tom, what about solving this issue in the Delta? Is it possible to get all these stakeholders in a room and have a discussion? And has this been done before?
Oh, it's been done several times with mixed results, I think it's fair to say. In the 1990s, there was a piece of legislation passed. It was called the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, which mandated that state government, federal government, the relative agencies, and then stakeholder groups, environmentalists, cities, farmers, that they all kind of needed to work holistically to solve problems. A big effort was made, and after about 10 years, that kind of collapsed and led to a huge number of lawsuits, just waves and waves of lawsuits. A lot of people seem to be starting to exhaust themselves in the lawsuits, and now there's more interest, it seems to me, on cooperation again. And there's been some surprisingly good efforts at cooperation here in the San Joaquin Valley. Farmers and environmentalists actually finding ways to sit down and talk to each other and even start working out some potential solutions. I mean, they suspect they've got a ways to go, but we've got to make a start, and I think we have made a start.
So are these coalitions happening? Are people meeting up and they're discussing these issues?
They are. We have one here in the valley. It's called Water Blueprint. And it's the one that's, in my mind, seems to have gotten the most attention. Trying to develop between environmentalists and farmers and other stakeholders, kind of unified proposals that they can give to the governor and the legislature to enhance water reliability for farmers, and at the same time, try to do something for the environment.
Now, for us in Southern California, our water mainly comes from the Delta. Is that true?
A lot of Southern California's water does come from the Delta. There's some local rivers as well. The big exception, though, is Los Angeles itself. Los Angeles gets its water from three sources. The Los Angeles River, but it also gets a large amount of its water from Eastern California, a place called the Owens Valley. It's a long story, but over a century ago, LA's leaders at the time, including a man named William Mulholland, basically acquired the water rights to the Owens River in Eastern California, which means they legally gained control of that water, then built a giant canal called the Los Angeles Aqueduct that ships all that water to Los Angeles. I mean, huge amounts of water. And then about a decade later, Los Angeles and the Imperial Valley, down at the California-Mexican border, became big players in negotiating compromises on the Colorado River. And the Colorado River, of course, forms part of the border between California and Arizona. And California got a huge cut of the Colorado River, splitting that water between the Imperial Valley and Los Angeles. So Los Angeles primarily gets its water from the Colorado River, the Owens Valley, and the LA River, not so much the Delta. People of California really need to find a way to solve our political battles over water, which are probably more intractable than any of our engineering or hydrological problems with water. I mean, we have laws that have kind of been on the books since the 19th century that we have not seriously revisited that really need to be changed to match, the current reality of water. And, we really need the state legislature to step up and seriously look at overhauling our water laws. I think that would help us immensely.
Tom Holyoke, professor of political science at California State University in Fresno. It was great to have you on California Insider.
Great. Thank you.